Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and welcome. Welcome to Las Noticias from the Border. My name is John Fanistel, Executive Director here at VIA International. And on behalf of VIA International, the staff team, which is with us today, and friends of VIA International from both San Diego and Tijuana, we welcome you to this edition of Las Noticias from the Border. This Tuesday 12 noon series we've designed to try to get a perspective on what's happening in the news, the national news in the United States in particular, but as seen from the unique perspective of the US-Mexico border. Today being election day, I figured there was nothing else to talk about but presidential politics and US politics. And so I invited my friend Steve Farnsworth to join us. I'll introduce him to you in just a minute. First, though, I do want to reflect on just a couple of thoughts that have crossed my mind, things that I'll be looking for, perhaps that you won't hear talked about in the national news, that I think are of potentially of great interest to those of us who live along the US-Mexico border. I'm thinking about this in terms of the way I hear the national conversation talk about Hispanic or Latino voters. Here in San Diego, 40% of our county is of Latino, but really in our neck of the woods, what that means is predominantly of Mexican ancestry. Whereas in other parts of the country, Latino can mean an entirely different mix. And in the past few days, I've heard a couple of very interesting conversations. Perhaps you've heard snippets of this as well. One is that many people are wondering whether this is the year that the demographic changes in places like Arizona and Texas will play out as they have played out here in California across the last several election cycles. The sheer demographics and especially the growth in that Mexican and Mexican-American, Mexican ancestry, Mexican-American population, every indication is that Arizona and Texas will follow California's political trajectory in the coming years. The question is, will we see that play out in some surprising election results even today? The other conversation perhaps you've heard is that Joe Biden is not performing nearly as well as Hillary Clinton did with some Latino voters and especially Latino males. This is of particular importance in the state of Florida, you've heard, but also in places like North Carolina and Pennsylvania, which have surprisingly large Latino populations. These folks might include Mexican ancestry folks, but of course you'd have a predominance of Puerto Rican ancestry, other parts of Central America, and a Cuban ancestry vote in Florida in particular. So my hope, to be honest, among other hopes I might harbor about this election, one of my hopes is that this might spark a more nuanced conversation about the quote unquote Latino vote. And I can imagine that happening for all kinds of reasons, some of which you might consider good and some of which you might consider bad. That if there's a surprising vote in the Southwest United States, for instance, I can imagine that could be rightly recognized as one of the real bellwether changes of a Biden win. Conversely, if Trump were to eke out the state of Florida, I think we'll hear the Biden campaign and other Democratic leaders kind of revisiting their strategy with the Latino vote, much the way Hillary Clinton's campaign was forced to revisit their strategy around the upper Midwestern states. So those are just some kind of thoughts of mine. I'm really interested to see, will our mainstream media, our national media, take more seriously the diversity and the history and the cultures of Latino or Hispanic populations in the United States. My joke around here is that I've never met anybody who calls themselves Hispanic. They're Mexican or Mexican-American or Chicano or fronterizo. We've talked a lot about that on Tuesdays, the cultural identity of the borderlands. And so I'm hopeful that for good reasons or bad, we might have a more nuanced conversation at the national level about the peoples of the US-Mexico borderlands. I could go on about other fears I have, hopes I have, but that's not really the point of today. The point of today's session is for me to introduce you to my friend Steve Farnsworth, who I've known since we were undergraduates at Dartmouth College many years ago. Steve is a journalist, worked for years as a journalist, and then went back and got his PhD in political science and communications, and is a professor at Mary Washington University out in Virginia, just outside of Washington. Steve is an expert in presidential communications, has published 6 or 7 books, I've lost track by now, in this field, and is a real expert in the communications component of running both a presidential campaign and running a presidency itself. And so it's my great pleasure, just a joy for me to welcome Steve Farnsworth. Will you join me with a round of applause as we welcome Steve Farnsworth to Las Noticias from the Border? Steve, welcome.
Well, thanks so much. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to have this conversation. We've been talking politics in good times and bad, and I'll leave it to everybody to determine which is which for 30 plus years now. And so we'll have a conversation today about the latest election of our lifetime.
Yeah, and Steve, I was asking, today's a busy day for you, I'm sure. I know you're a regular guest on Canadian TV. Do you have other bookings today on your schedule for media interviews?
Yeah, well, when the votes start being counted in the East, that's when the reporters start to call. But I've had a few people sort of schedule time with me, so I'm going to do one of the local television affiliates here in Washington, and I'm going to be doing that. The Washington Post often talks to me about Virginia politics. I'm going to be talking with them tonight. And then I do CTV News Canada. Since I was a Fulbright in Montreal, they've been asking me to, I guess the word is decipher American politics for the Canadian audience for a few years now. So there's plenty to talk about. And so we'll have a lot of material to weigh over, even though the results may be partial for the next day or two. We're looking at pretty interesting times.
Yeah, I know our Canadian friends, I often imagine the nation of Canada scratching its head as it looks down upon the United States and tries to understand what the heck our politics, how the heck our politics get the way they do. Well, let me ask you, Steve, just because I know you've been following the campaign as you always do so closely. So let me just a general question: what's been most surprising to you about this presidential campaign? And is there one thing that's really played out true to form, something that you just kind of knew was going to happen and in fact has played out the way you thought it did?
Well, the thing that surprised me the most has been the real lack of interest in the Trump presidency and the Trump campaign to reach out to people not already in their corner. I think that when you look at presidential elections, one of the things you try to do is kind of expand your appeal during the campaign to those people who are not automatically going to support you, because particularly for Trump, who lost the popular vote by 3 million votes in 2016, who's never been over 50% approval in the polls, it doesn't make sense to say, I got my 43, my 45, and I'm happy with that. That's not a recipe for success. And it really has seemed so strange to me that the Trump presidency hasn't done more to reach out beyond those Christian conservatives, beyond those reflexive Republicans, beyond those people who are in Trump's corner. There are ways he could have done it. He could have talked about one of the things that, among the things that might have been. I'm not sure how some of you would feel about it, but Trump could have said, here's the deal. I'll give you Dreamers and you'll give me more money for a wall. And that might not be popular in San Diego, but certainly for those people who are struggling being in the Dreamer category, that might have been a tempting deal for Democrats to take. That would have made him suggest as a more centrist politician. He could have spent more money and more attention on infrastructure. He could have looked at taking science more seriously. A lot of the losses that Trump has had in his approval ratings have come from suburban educated folks who don't like the idea of using denial with respect to COVID-19 or minimization as a strategy for coping. So that's the thing that surprised me the most. I mean, you would think that the campaign would try harder to reach out to those people because that's how you win an election. The thing that seemed very, very true to form in terms of how elections have been run in the past is the idea that when there's an incumbent president on the ballot, it is a referendum on that president. I imagine we will not talk very much about Joe Biden today, because during the campaign, there was very little conversation about Joe Biden. I mean, even Joe Biden's argument is largely, I'm not him. I'm better than him. I'm this way that he's not. I have this policy that he's not. But ultimately, when people are looking at this election, even the people who say they're voting for Biden say that voting against Trump is at least as important to them as voting for Biden. And so I think that that's true to form. When you look at Obama in 2012, when you look at George W. Bush in 2004, Bill Clinton in 96, Reagan in 84, it goes back to that basic question: do you want 4 more years of this?
Yeah.
And generally speaking, incumbent presidents get another 4 years unless they've been overwhelmed by events. Jimmy Carter in the hostage crisis, George H.W. Bush in the recession of 92. And I would argue in that same pattern is the crisis that the Trump administration has faced, economic and healthcare crisis, that is COVID.
Well, that's a great segue to my next question, which is what grade would you give each of the campaigns? It sounds to me like you're not going to give a very high grade to the Trump campaign just on in terms of sheer efficiency or effectiveness. I've been struck by how much he's really kind of been I don't know if grasping for a message, or maybe that attributes too much intent to it. But he went from Law and Order, then of course to Hunter Biden, then of course to the suburbs. They're coming to get you in the suburbs, then back to Hunter Biden, and now it seems to be just about the campaign seems to be about declaring victory. No matter what the votes say, or trying to discount late votes. It seems to me they kind of, I don't know, the phrase that comes to my mind is somebody stumbling around with a spotlight trying to find an issue that would track. What would you give what grade in terms of just effectiveness would you give to the Trump campaign?
Well, there are things that the Trump campaign has done well in terms of communication. They have been able to connect with the Christian conservative element of the Republican Party consistently. And if you look at the greatest success from the point of view of the Trump agenda, I would say it's the remaking of the judiciary.
Right. The
focus was on the courts, and that president delivered for those supporters. And so, but that is something that they're not talking about all that much right now. I think, when you talk about kind of a staggering campaign, I see this as really undisciplined. And so I think we're on the same wavelength here on this point, because when you look at the Trump message, it isn't just, I got you a conservative judiciary. It isn't just, anything consistent. And I think that this is largely a lack of discipline. I think that, in all honesty, the Trump campaign really misses Steve Bannon. I think Steve Bannon was a really effective person who could keep the focus of somebody who is not naturally, I think, a focused person. I think Donald Trump is not really disciplined and focused as a politician in his own instincts. And so when he's left to do what he wants, he goes all over the place. And it's odd to me that there's so much talk about resentment and unfairness because he actually won the election. He is president. And the resentment of how things aren't working out for him seems sort of a weird case to make when you're in the office. And so I guess I'd be looking at maybe a D+ for the man. He did some things well, but ultimately, on balance, when it comes to reaching out to swing voters and communicating effectively with them, it's not working. Just in terms of the suburbs, for example, where Republicans could and should do better if they're going to win nationally, Trump could have been saying something other than a vision of the suburbs that I would argue is the white flight 1970s version of the suburbs.
Yes.
That's not what the suburbs look like anymore. You know that around San Diego. I live in the DC area. We see it here. The suburbs are very, very diverse. It's not at all the suburbs of the 70s and 80s, but the message seems to be stuck in that time. The Joe Biden campaign, I think the Joe Biden campaign communication strategy is simply to say as little as possible, keep the focus on Trump. I mean, this is one of those rare opportunities in politics where a politician can say, the less I say, the better. The more my opponent talks, the better. And although Joe Biden also has kind of a reputation as being kind of undisciplined in terms of the way that he communicates, this campaign, I think, has been very effectively run in terms of not talking, in terms of minimizing what you have to say. And that reality, I think, is the reason why I would give the Biden campaign a much more effective grade. I mean, he obviously doesn't communicate with the elan or the passion or the articulateness of Barack Obama, but he didn't need to.
Yeah.
He found the moment and he made the most of it. And so I'm thinking maybe a B+, A- for Biden on this one.
But yeah, kind of he wrote the very short paper. He met the bare minimum word requirement for that essay, but it was on point and didn't shoot himself in the foot, huh?
Pretty much, you know?
Yeah, yeah. So then, we were talking about the debates, and there was a lot of Democratic anxiety this election season for all kinds of reasons. Biden's debate performances was among them, but you and I compared notes after each of the debates, the two debates that actually transpired, and your take was that Biden, held himself up reputably. You feel like his goal there was just to not to do no harm, no big gaffes, don't shoot himself in the foot, let Trump, self-sabotage.
Absolutely. And Biden was able at moments here and there to just basically draw people's attention to the absurdity of what Trump was saying, that this is ridiculous, this is absurd, this is false. I mean, you can't be in a debate situation a moment by moment fact checker. That's not really going to work.
Yeah.
But what does work is to leave that to others and just draw points here and there to particular things that you anticipate Trump saying and you are prepared to respond, And the reality is that Biden can make a lot of headway with that sliver of voters who might be tempted to vote one way or the other with the question of COVID performance. I think that ultimately that is going to matter. And that's something that is really, really powerful in terms of the way that people are looking at this election. Normally, the election is on the economy. That's the normal question that matters most to people when they decide how they're going to vote after their partisan identity, because that's, of course, the lens through which people see everything, their partisan identity. But this year, it's COVID, and that is not helpful to the president. I think that Biden was most effective when he really sort of limited what he had to say. When you saw the town hall where Biden spoke separately, he occasionally was very deep into the weeds on policy. I think that Biden is somebody who is much better at the governing aspect of politics than the campaigning aspect. And clearly he knows policy. He knows it backwards and forwards. He's going on and on about the particulars of the Obamacare healthcare law and how to fix it. And that kind of detail orientation, I don't know that necessarily persuades anybody. It demonstrates that Biden knows what he's talking about, but it's not the kind of thing to get people passionate and excited about a candidate. But that mattered less, I think, because Biden in many of these opportunities really didn't have time to say more than a sentence or two before he was interrupted.
Right. That first debate in particular was just a colossal nightmare in that regard. Well, then the other source of great anxiety among Democrats this cycle, of course, has been the polls and really revisiting ghosts from 4 years past. I know in your academic work, you use quantitative methods. You do your own surveying but you also follow the polls closely. But how do you think about polls, and should Democrats pay as much attention to the polls as they do, or should they be as freaked out about the polls and the uncertainty as they are? How do you think about polling in the context of a presidential campaign in particular?
Well, I think it's important to realize that polling has its limitations as a technique. We are trying to figure out what a country of 300 some million people are going to do based on a survey of, let's say, 1,000 people. That's the norm. Or a state on a 1,000-person survey. And so there is going to be some uncertainty about what's coming out of that kind of technology. And think about it this way. If I had 1,000 pennies and I threw them up in the air and they all landed on the table, we'd expect roughly 500 to be heads, 500 to be tails. But if I did this 1,000 times, 10,000 times, maybe one of those times I get 800 heads. Maybe even 850, okay? Not very likely, very rare, but not impossible. And there's no way of knowing when you do a single survey if that survey is an exact match of where people are, or even with the most professional techniques out there, that you've got that 1 in 1,000 chance that shows numbers that don't match up in the representativeness of this survey. You just don't know. Yeah. And so that's the first problem with surveys. It's a blunt instrument. The second problem, of course, is that it's a snapshot. And this was one of the big problems in 2016. The surveys basically stopped. If you're thinking about the surveys in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, they basically stopped with Hillary Clinton ahead, about a week ahead of the election. But if you remember what happened in that last week, the FBI director, James Comey, said, oh, by the way, we're going to be looking at emails again. And then a couple of days later, he said, well, now we're not going to be looking at emails again. But during that time, people are casting early ballots. They are looking at this and saying, here we go again, another Clinton scandal. I'm beginning to think what the next 4 years will be like if she ends up being president. That's not captured in a survey that's conducted before Comey makes his announcement. Right. And if you look at the, and it isn't just that it was a Comey announcement, it dominated the news coverage of that last week of the campaign. If you look at the coverage, the Clinton coverage during that last week of October and the first few days of November, it went south in a dramatic way. It was much, much more negative towards her. And it was compared to previous weeks in the election campaign. And comparatively, it was more positive towards Trump because the focus was on Hillary Clinton and not what had been a pretty scandal-filled Trump campaign up to that point. Yeah. So there's a limit to that. Now, we have done things differently in 2020 with surveys to try to make things better. One thing we did technically was that we are much more inclined to look at the question of what percentage of this population in this survey is whites who are not possessing a college degree, okay? Because that was one of the areas where Trump did really, really well. And the surveys were not designed to capture that as effectively as it might. Oftentimes, white working class voters are less likely to turn out, but Trump brought a higher level of that segment of the electorate into the conversation. So the polls have been done more effectively this time. Yeah. And they're being done closer to the election this time. There really wasn't the same kind of October surprise that you saw in 2016. So there are ways that you can feel good about the polls being better, but make no mistake about it. There's always going to be a margin of error. And so if you want to be anxious, why certainly you can find a reason to be.
Well, yes, I've been ticking off reasons to be anxious myself. One thing I found reassuring, I think it may have been from you or somebody else, was to say that you have a 4-point, there's in a head-to-head race like this, it's one thing to say you have a 4-point lead in the polls if it's 48 to 44, because that of course only totals 92, which means there's still 8% of likely voters who are unaccounted for. Whereas if you have a 6-point lead at 52-46, well, that's 98, and there's only, so in some sense, and there's no third-party candidate this time around. So it does seem that Biden's lead in the polls, for all these reasons that you've mentioned, those two that I just mentioned, it seems to me, I'm again trying to buck myself up here, seems to me a little bit more, the polls seem a little bit more reliable. I don't know, is that being too optimistic?
Well, I think that's true. I mean, one of the things to remember about the 2016 polls is that Biden is consistently over 50 in these swing states. Trump is under 50 in these swing states. And the approval rating for an incumbent president often tracks quite closely with the percentage of the vote that they get in their reelection campaign. And those numbers in the swing states, again, are 45, 43, 44. And in all likelihood, we have a much better sense, I think, in 2020 from our polls about what we'll see on election day than we did in 2016, in part because people learned from 2016 not to stop polling the week before the election, but to keep, to sort of run through the tape, if you will, run right to the finish line in terms of the survey research. So you add those things together, I think the numbers are more compelling. I mean, let me put it this way. I think there are 3 reasons why 2020 isn't 2016. And the polling, I think, is reflecting this. The first one is that Trump is the incumbent president, and he's being evaluated in terms of that. The second thing, of course, is that there is an energized electorate in a very different way. If you're thinking about the folks who are animated by what has happened on the streets of this country or in the jail cells along the border, you have people who are really, really energized, particularly young voters. Yeah. And so you have an energized electorate that is really, really hostile to Trump, that is part of the mix this year. And that's a lot of young people. It's a lot of people who are African-American or Latino-American. And those groups are not favorable to Trump anyway. And so if they turn out in greater numbers, that's not good news for the Republicans. The third thing, of course, is that Hillary Clinton was seen pretty negatively, even by people who supported her. You don't see this with Biden. Biden is seen as an appealing choice in large part because he seems like an adult and he seems like a professional. He may not inspire a lot of passion. He's not Bernie Sanders, but he also doesn't inspire all that much dislike or contempt. And all three of those factors that make 2020 different than 2016 favor the Democrats. So I do think that if my job here today is to make people feel less anxious, I would draw your attention to those important factors that mean we're not looking at the same movie.
Yes, I'm feeling better already. Thank you. Now, I do want to, of course, take this opportunity to clarify and assert very publicly that, of course, Via International is a nonprofit and therefore nonpartisan organization. But as an organization rooted in the borderlands, you can understand, I think any rational observer could understand the antipathy that is very prominent in our networks of people. I mean, in 2016, Donald Trump basically branded his campaign with the logo of the border wall, and he announced it by calling Mexicans rapists and murderers. So our networks here along the border have a longstanding antipathy towards President Trump because of the way he's conducted himself, both as a candidate and as a president. I'm interested in this, your take. You've studied extensively the qualities of presidential leadership that resonate with voters. So and one of your books is specifically about character, communications and character in the presidency. And I'm struck by this kind of dual meaning of the word that you allude to. On the one hand, character can refer to the content of our character, the values, morals. That the other is a character in a drama or in a show. And it seems to me that President Trump, reality TV star and so forth, it has been kind of a character in a show, but maybe hasn't quite won people over as far as his personal character. Is that too simplistic a way of thinking about it? Or how do you think about presidential character and presidential leadership?
Yeah, I think that this really is the way that a lot of people look at political leaders. I mean, remember, when you're electing a president, you're electing somebody to represent this country, to make big decisions for 4 years. And who knows what is going to come down the pike in those next 4 years that lie ahead. If you think about the 2000 election, for example, there was almost no coverage of foreign policy. In one of my books, The Nightly News Nightmare, I looked at all the coverage leading up to the election of 2000. And there were only 10 stories on the evening news across 3 networks and across 2 months that focused on foreign policy. We really thought foreign policy, we're done with that. It's a domestic presidency now. Cold War is over. We won. Good for us. Okay. So that we had. But the reality is that if you look at the dynamics of the Bush presidency that followed, it was almost entirely a foreign policy presidency, right? 9/11 happens, the Iraq War happens, the Afghanistan situation. All these issues are out there and are really powerful dynamics with respect to the way that Bush had to operate as president. And so I think character matters a lot because it's a vehicle for feeling like, okay, I can trust this person. I don't know what they're going to have to deal with. Who knows what the future holds, but I can feel good about it because they are someone that I can respect, that I can trust their judgment. Now, whether or not they make the right decisions or not once they're in office is something that people can agree or disagree on. But what you knew about George W. Bush was sort of what you saw about George W. Bush thinking about character. If you thought of Bush as being somebody who was pretty aggressive, well, he was that. If you think about Bush, who was somebody who was pretty decisive, he wasn't inclined to agonize over decisions. That's what you got too. And similarly with Obama, when you think about what people might have wanted in the Bush presidency and didn't get, maybe a more thoughtful, deliberate, considered approach to politics, well, Barack Obama is that. If anything, he's attacked for being too analytical, too dispassionate, too oriented towards this issue of analysis. And so, maybe, we want what we don't have in politics. We wanted somebody who had a higher moral standing than Bill Clinton. We choose Bush. We wanted somebody who was a little bit more analytical than Bush. We choose Obama. We want somebody who maybe can speak to our anxieties and fears, and we get Trump. So I do think character matters. And that matters, I think, particularly among that sliver of voters who are not reflexively Democrats or reflexively Republicans. They're not going to care a lot about issues. They're not going to know a lot about issues. They're going to look at this person and say, Do I want this person? Do I want that person? And they base it on what they see online, what they see on the TV, what they see in their limited focus of politics. That's not to say that their perspective is not a rational one. It makes sense for them, and that's their right. They can choose by whatever measure they like. But that's one aspect of character. Yes. And I think that that's one of the things that Biden has emphasized in his campaign. Once again, I'm what he's not. That Biden is focused on trying to bring things together, trying to make things work in a way that is responsible and not so chaotic. So I think that that's part of it. But the idea of character, I think, speaks in the second dimension to the Donald Trump presidency. Because remember, Donald Trump was a reality show star before he became a candidate for office. And before that, even earlier in the 70s and the 80s, he was a celebrity on the page 6 of the tabloids in New York City. So he was this sort of character in terms of building copy going back as early as the mid 70s. So this pattern of who Trump is basically about this kind of, well, I would describe him as kind of a billionaire, blustery billionaire, sort of a stereotypical master of the universe, if you will, in terms of, a Wall Street guy who's got lots of real estate, lots of property, and lives this sort of penthouse style life. Now, I'm not sure how that converts to being a tribune of the people, but he made it work as a campaign message in 2016. Yeah. But the reality is that he spoke effectively to the anxieties and the fears of people in middle America. And let me just spend a second on that, because I think this is really important to understand why Trump won.
Yes.
Think about the people who live in Youngstown or Akron or Buffalo. Think about the world that their fathers knew and their grandfathers. The guys who fought in World War II, maybe people of the generation ahead of us, or Korea. They went to high school, they fought for their country, they came back, and they got a job at a steel mill or an auto plant or some other industrial factory. And it was good work. It was union work. It was a good middle-class living. They bought a house in the suburbs. They had money to send their kids to college. They had time to get a couple of weeks of vacation, maybe up in the mountains somewhere or at the beach, whatever their preference might be. That's the world of the 50s and the 60s, those people in those communities. Now, what about the generation today? The factories are closing. The jobs are going offshore. The trade deals are bad from the point of view of industrial production in the United States. And what kind of a world do these communities have for their children? What kind of jobs might a high school graduate have now in terms of the kind of world that they see? And so if you look across 2 or 3 generations in the industrial Midwest, you can see why they think, oh my goodness, we're on the road to disaster. And for farming, it's even worse, because farmers have to borrow all this money to plant, to buy the equipment, to buy the land, and then they have to pay off the bankers at the end of the year. Hopefully their crops produced. There wasn't a flood. There wasn't a drought. There wasn't anything with respect to international trade deals that affected the money they thought they were going to get for the bushel of soybeans, the bushel of corn, whatever it might be. So all these people are dealing with anxiety, particularly in the Midwest, the agricultural and industrial Midwest. They look at the future and they're not optimistic. They look at the present and they think it isn't as good as their father's present. And so when you think about those people, you can understand why they look at Democrats and Republicans alike and say, this isn't working. Yes. Donald Trump says, I get you. I understand you. And I'm the only person who's really going to talk to you. And that's why he won.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been reading a book, Michael Sandel, about meritocracy. And his observation is much like yours, that, post-war, several decades post-World War II, there was still a belief and some rationale for it in a meritocracy in the United States. But since 1980, the opportunities to rise, never mind the gross inequity, I mean, extreme and perverse inequity between rich and poor, but the opportunity to advance has evaporated for lower income Americans. And so it's not just that they've gotten the bad end of the economic stick, but that they're really are. His argument is that their paths to advance have been foreclosed, and yet they continue to be told especially by liberal elites, that it is still a meritocracy. And if they would just work hard enough, they could pull it off. That resentment, he calls it, cultural resentment, he believes is a driving force in Trump's election. It resonated with much of what you just summarized for us there. So, well, let me ask you just a couple of quick things about your, more right down into your wheelhouse communications. I want to ask you about Trump's use of Twitter, because in one of your books, I recall, you observed that presidents are really, in many ways, come to be associated with, or they perhaps become presidents because they really they dominate, or they have mastery over specific media. So Ronald Reagan, broadcast TV; Bill Clinton, cable television; Barack Obama, peer-to-peer networking. And I know one of your books is on late night comedy, and these different formats and different media within the media. And Trump, of course, has really made Twitter his main game. Is Twitter the way that the way of the presidency? Is this what we should expect moving forward? Is that the presidency, no matter who it is, will have to kind of conduct itself on Twitter, or was this a Trump? Has this been a Trump outlier in that regard?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that the message that you offer will work better or worse depending on the media that you use to get there. I mean, if you think about Trump, who doesn't really want to spend a lot of time thinking about the details of politics, of policy, if you primarily think about campaigning through nicknames like, Sleepy Joe or Creepy Joe, if you think about, insulting people, then, Twitter's the perfect vehicle for you, right? You don't have to have a sustained argument. You only need a few hundred characters. That's all you get. That's all you have to say. It wouldn't work for Barack Obama necessarily to talk about a healthcare plan on Twitter. That wouldn't work because he had details that he wanted to get across. But for Trump, if the issue is just that the election is being stolen, or that China is eating our lunch, or that little Marco Rubio shouldn't be president, if it's something simple like that, Twitter's the perfect vehicle for that. I mean, it is that great marriage of message content and message delivery system that explains why Twitter and Trump have been such a successful marriage. More to the point, for the next president, though, is that they will need to find their own. Some people work in sculpture, some people work in oils, some people work in words. These are different techniques that work differently depending on the way that you want to do it. I'm not sure that Biden is a natural for Twitter. I don't think that he governs in soundbite in the way that Trump does. I don't think he communicates in soundbite the way Trump does. So it may be something else. But, if there's one thing that people who study the media are always worried about, is that they're going to invest too much in a technology that disappears on them. I mean, I know somebody who wrote a dissertation on MySpace. They had to find something else to talk about really fast when they started looking for a job. The Friendster scholars don't really have much in the way of tenure track opportunities. So, and so I don't know what's going to happen with Twitter. I tend to think you have to use it, but I can't imagine that Biden will use Twitter the way that Trump has, that it will be a focus of his communication effort. My guess is that he might do a more kind of Obama style where he hangs out on late night TV. He swaps insults with Zach Galifianakis and lets it go at that.
Yeah. And I guess it'll also be interesting to see how Kamala Harris chooses to play this and how she develops her own, means of communicating with the public. So, well, Steve, thanks so much. This has been great. And I have several questions stacking up that we're going to answer here in the Zoom room. I just want to give a shout out on Facebook before we sign off that if you'd like to join us in Zoom, just drop us a message with your email address and we'll email you the Zoom information. This is a program to Las Noticias at the Border. We convene Tuesdays at noon. We meet on Zoom and then live stream to Facebook. Next Tuesday, just a quick shout out, my guest will be Jason De Leon, the anthropologist at UCLA, who is one of the nation's foremost authorities on undocumented migration, and specifically on the deaths that have resulted from undocumented migration being forced further and further into the hinterlands, the mountains of Eastern California, the deserts of Arizona. Jason De Leon, a remarkable study of the contents and material that migrants have left behind in the deserts of Arizona. He's curated that and has done an entire kind of portrayal of the undocumented experience through the collection of material that migrants leave behind while crossing through the desert. He'll be a great person to talk to about the implications of this presidential election for policy, U.S.-Mexico policy here on the U.S.-Mexico border. Steve, before we go, just to sign off of our Facebook friends, I do want to ask you just about the horse race, since most of the questions people are, of course, focused on that today. Who, without asking you to predict outcomes, who will you be watching tonight, or where will you be going tonight? And what kind of, are there a couple of key markers or key things that you'll be looking for, just to early reads on the, tea leaves of what we might be looking at in this presidential election?
Sure. The first thing to know is that normally elections are won and lost, the national elections in the United States, in the central time zone, in the Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Ohio configuration of states. Those are where elections are usually won and lost. And so it might also be this year. But it's also the case that the election might be won or lost in the Eastern time zone this time around. One of the things that's different about 2020 is the extent to which the Biden campaign has made a very aggressive push for some states that are normally Republican. And that isn't just Florida, it's also Georgia and North Carolina. Now, the good news about Florida and North Carolina is that both of those states report relatively early and they report relatively accurately. They've also had the ability, unlike some states, to count the early votes ahead of time. So we're going to be getting relatively good numbers relatively quickly from those states. And if Trump does well in North Carolina and Georgia, well, then it might be a long night. If he doesn't do well in some of those states, there would be a sense that maybe it won't be such a long night. Of course, being in California, one of the things that always seemed nice about California when I was a kid, and wanted to watch the Red Sox play on the West Coast, I basically had to be up half the night to do it. But the reality is that, it's what's a long night for us might not be a long night for you. Yeah. But so look for the East Coast and look for Georgia and North Carolina and Florida in particular. Pennsylvania, they didn't get to count the ballots ahead of time, so we can expect that to be undecided all night long. Yeah. And then the central time zone, those three states that Hillary Clinton lost, look back to those close states in the Midwest. Is there a problem for Biden in Wisconsin? Is there a problem in Michigan? Polls show him ahead, but we'll see when the votes are counted whether those polls match up. And then you go further west, right? I mean, Arizona is a key place for not only control of the White House, but also control of the Senate. There's a Democratic pickup prospect there in potentially the astronaut turned senator, Mark Kelly. So, there are things to watch. But one of the things to see across the board is that question that you started us with, what happens to the Latino vote in many of these places? Because the Latino vote in one state can be very different from another in terms of whether it's primarily Mexican-American or Cuban-American or Salvadoran-American, and that can create dynamics. And that may be the deciding factor in places like Michigan or in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where there is a significantly larger population, of Latinos than you traditionally think of them as being focused on the border area. But it's a national dynamic now.
Yeah. And those are great tips to look for. And are you feeling, as I am, that there's kind of like you're saying, almost a fork in the road? Either there's some early returns that make things look very, that kind of foreclose a lot of the options for Donald Trump to be reelected, or it turns into a too close to call kind of scenario, which could get dragged out over days or even weeks. Is that, do you have that feeling that here today or tomorrow we'll reach that fork in the road and we'll either feel like the outcome is coming clear, or we're in for a hell of a ride with a lot of uncertainty?
Yeah, I sort of feel like if Biden is clearly going to win, we'll know that by around the time the polls close in California, or maybe an hour after that. That would be sort of the dynamic. If it's close, why then who knows? You want to be a little bit uncertain about this election because we're looking at such massive turnout, such early turnout, such huge numbers there that is taking place in the middle of COVID. It's not clear yet today whether the people worried about COVID are turning out to vote if they haven't already. Some of the early numbers suggest relatively low election day turnout. And if those numbers hold, that may give us a different electorate than we were expecting.
Yeah.
So, if you want a guaranteed prediction, why I think that's a matter of faith rather than science.
You got it. Well, listen, Steve, thanks very much. Let me ask you to join me at the round of applause. We're going to continue the conversation here on Zoom, but we'll for now sign off from our Facebook audience. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll hope to see you next Tuesday for Las Noticias from the Border. Bye-bye. Hasta luego. Hasta la próxima.